think that if you go back and you look at what happened in April, it was not only the Iranians who worked to limit the attack, the Iranians actually coordinated with the Americans because, as you say, both the Americans and the Iranians wanted to avoid a war that involved the two of them fighting each other. This is a very different story. The Iranians have made it clear that this time they're not going to work with the Americans to limit the attack, and they're really going to try to slam Israel. Exactly what that means is hard to say, but I would imagine that they will launch a much more forceful attack this time than in April, and I wouldn't be surprised if it comes in multiple waves. And very importantly, the last time we were able to convince the Israelis to limit their retaliation on April 19th. This is after the Iranians struck on April 14th. On April 19th, the Israelis retaliated with a minor strike, and that was in large part because we convinced them to do that. I don't think that will be the case this time. So I think what you're talking about here is a situation where Iran slams Israel and Israel slams Iran back, and then in all likelihood the Iranians will retaliate, and in all likelihood the Israelis will retaliate. So you'll go up the escalation ladder. That's what it looks like at this point in time. I hope that doesn't prove to be the case. And with regard to the Americans, I think we're basically caught in the middle because we are committed to helping to defend Israel. Israel cannot defend itself, as we saw the last time in April. They need the Americans, and we have promised that we'll be in the fight with them. So the Iranians and the Israelis look like they're headed for a major conflict, and we're caught in the middle.
I guess why that jars me a little bit to hear you say is that in the past, whenever I've been very concerned about escalation in the region, you've sort of come on to give some assuring words that it's unlikely, that no one really wants that. Certainly the Americans don't, the Iranians don't. And it appears like this time you're somewhat saying the opposite, that you kind of expect a very dangerous conflagration. And I'm not saying that means that you expect it to be some unlimited escalation, although it appears that you're suggesting that that's quite possible. And as you say, this is not a war between two other countries on the other side of the war. This is a war that the United States government, whatever that means at this point, has explicitly said it's going to intervene and defend Israel, has already deployed major military assets to the region to do so. Why? This seems like that should be one of the only things people are really talking about, and it seems like it's not really forefront on most people's minds. Is that your impression as well?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think most people are not paying serious attention to this, and they can't imagine what the consequences are going to be. Just to take this a step further, Glenn, there's the Iranian dimension, which you and I are now talking about. There's also the Hezbollah dimension. You want to remember that not only are Hezbollah and Iran very close allies in this fight, but also there was a double assassination. There was the assassination in Tehran, which has precipitated the possibility of a major Iranian blow against Israel. But there was also an assassination against a high-level Hezbollah operative in Beirut, which has given the Hezbollah leaders a very powerful incentive to retaliate against Israel. So it is easy to imagine a war breaking out between Hezbollah and Iran on one side and Israel and the United States on the other side. And if you just talk about Hezbollah has somewhere, they now say, between 150,000 and 200,000 rockets and missiles aimed at Israel, many of which are highly accurate. The amount of damage that a missile force like that could cause is truly great. And the Israeli Iron Dome system is not going to be able to deal with many of those incoming missiles or rockets. And the same, by the way, is true with the ballistic missiles coming in from Iran. So I think that Israel is really going to get slammed in the event that you have a war that escalates between both Hezbollah and Iran on one side and Israel on the other side. And I sometimes say to myself, I wonder what the Israelis are thinking here. Why are they at all interested in going down this road? From a strategic point of view, it just makes no sense at all. And then you say to yourself, well, the Israelis may invade Lebanon. They can't invade Lebanon. Their army is worn out from what's happening in Gaza. There's just all sorts of evidence of that coming from the Israeli side. They don't have an army that can go into Lebanon and eliminate this threat. So they're just in really deep trouble. And what do in response to this situation? They just keep digging deeper. And it befuddles me as to what they're thinking.
I want to get back to that very, very quickly, but before we get to the Israeli perspective, I just want to stick a little bit more with the Iranian perspective, because the huge looming reality for Iran is that the country they want to attack or retaliate against has nuclear weapons, and Iran does not. And we interviewed a professor who's a political scientist and historian about the use of nuclear weapons and why there hasn't been a repeat use since 1945. Yesterday was the 79th anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And she was essentially saying that what is at the core of it is not the use of nuclear weapons, but deterrence, the idea that a country that has nuclear weapons will not be meaningfully attacked because of the fear that nuclear weapons will then be used against the country that attacks them. What is the calculus of the Iranians here? Why are they willing to risk that in order to avenge this murder on their soil?
I don't think an Iranian attack would be severe enough that it would justify a nuclear response.
But if there was escalation, if there's escalation and it goes up the escalatory ladder, there's a chance of that. I mean, I think that has to be in the calculus of the Iranian mind.
I think it has to be in the calculus. The question is, does it loom large or not? And I would think that they believe it doesn't loom large at all, that the Israelis are not going to use nuclear weapons. It is such a drastic step. And the truth is that Iran is not threatening the survival of Israel. If you're threatening the survival of Israel, they will roll out the nukes. The Israelis will. But this is going to be an attack, in all likelihood, that does some damage to Israel, maybe even serious damage, but doesn't threaten the survival. So I think they're not worried about nuclear weapons being used. I think if you want to extend this whole situation forward 5 to 10 years, I think that if you do have a war now between Iran and Israel, it will give Iran very powerful incentives to get nuclear weapons. The Iranians are very close to having nuclear weapons. They're enriching uranium up to the point where it's just a hop, skip, and a jump, where they have weapons grade uranium, and they can, make a bomb. They can't do it overnight, but they'll be very close. And if you posit a situation where these two mortal enemies, who are both basically paranoid, have nuclear weapons, and you get into a crisis 5 or 10 years from now, it would be extremely dangerous. You'd have crisis instability in the extreme. So what I'm saying to you, Glenn, is I don't think the nuclear problem matters that much here. But I think moving forward, this is going to become an increasingly dangerous dimension to this conflict.
So you mentioned earlier the vast stock of missiles that Hezbollah possesses. We've actually already demonstrated the ability to enter Israeli airspace undetected. They released some drone footage that they obtained just hovering over major Israeli military installations and some of the most sensitive Israeli targets of water and sewage and the sort of thing on which your civilian infrastructure depends. Just looking at Hezbollah alone, because my understanding is from the Israeli perspective is they always have taken extremely seriously the damage that could be done. You're talking about not just hundreds, but probably thousands of Israelis killed if they really were to do a serious retaliation with these missiles of the kinds that you're suggesting they might do. Not even an all-out retaliation, but just a serious retaliation. Can you tell me about the level of damage that you envision? And I know you're not a mind reader or a crystal ball reader, but what kind of retaliation or damage are we talking about that might be done to Israel? Are we talking about just a few buildings exploded? Or are we talking about the possibility of major civilian casualties?
Well, it all depends how far up the escalation ladder you go. And the question I always ask myself is, once they start up the escalation ladder, what are going to be the incentives on both sides to stop and to not go further up the ladder? And I think one could argue that you may have one or two exchanges involving Hezbollah and Israel or Iran and Israel, and both sides quickly come to the conclusion that it's not in their interest to go up, let's say, to the third rung of the ladder. And I think the Americans will be deeply committed from the get-go to preventing both sides, whether you're talking Hezbollah versus Israel or Iran versus Israel, to keep it limited, to put an end to it as quickly as possible. We don't want to see a major escalation. We don't even want to see the war start. So we'll do everything we can to cap the volcano. And if that happens, the damage will not be that great. But if you get to a situation where Hezbollah launches, let's say, 100,000 rockets and missiles on Israel, the damage would be enormous. Israel is not a big country. It doesn't have that many major cities. And they would, target some of the most important installations in Israel, both political, military, and economic. They would end up killing lots of people for sure. And then the Israelis would surely retaliate by going after Beirut. And God knows how many people in Beirut would be killed, which would just enrage Hezbollah and give them an incentive to try to kill even more Israelis. So if we don't cap that volcano, and I'm talking about the Americans, this conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, just that dimension of the conflict alone could result in huge numbers of civilian casualties in both Lebanon and Israel, and enormous damage done to the infrastructure that would have long-term consequences for both countries. And again, this is why I said to you before, Glenn, I do not understand for the life of me why the Israelis are going down this road and why they're not, working with us to try and just cool everybody's jets and shut this one down, because it's not in their interest to see a war happen.
Well, I want to propose some hypotheses about why the Israelis might be willing to go down that path, even though, as you say, it bears incredibly high risk for not just Israeli land, but for the Israeli citizens. But before we get to Israel and its perspective and motives, I just want to stick a little bit more with Iran and ask, what we saw with the bombing of their embassy in Damascus was, as we talked about at the start, a very restrained response that was obviously intended to kind of show their citizens and the region that they would not allow their embassy to be bombed with no response, but at the same time it was a response basically to ensure that it would be over very quickly, to avoid that escalatory risk. Why is this assassination of this Hamas leader on Iranian soil different in terms of what the Iranians feel compelled to do? Is it just that it's one too many, or is there something different in nature about it?
Well, it is a case of one too many. The first time the Israelis did it, I'm sure that we told them that we understood their position. Let's work out some sort of arrangement where your attack on Israel is limited, and we'll do what we can to make sure Israel's counterattack on Iran is limited, and that will put this behind us. And I think we thought, and the Iranians thought, that would put an end to provocative Israeli strikes against Iran. But that's not what happened. And from an Iranian point of view, they say to themselves, if we don't make it clear to the Israelis that they're going to pay a really serious price, they're going to continue to do this. The Iranians are interested in deterring the Israelis, just like the Israelis are interested in deterring the Iranians. And I'm sure the Iranians feel the best way to deter Israel is to really slam it and make it clear that in the future, if Israel does anything provocative like this, the costs will be very great. So you can see the Iranians have a deep-seated interest in making the Israelis pay a high cost. But as I said before, the Israelis will then have a deep-seated interest in making the Iranians pay a high cost. And there you go up the escalation.